Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this episode of George Talks Business. Today is our last session in the February series on artificial intelligence, and I'm delighted to introduce my co-host, Dr. Lynn Goldman, Dean of the Milken Institute School of Public Health and Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health. Thank you for joining us today, Lynn.
Thanks to you, Anuj.
And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Daniela Whitton, Professor of Statistics and Biostatistics at the University of Washington and the Dorothy Guilford Endowed Chair in Mathematical Statistics. Welcome, Daniela. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor.
So, Daniela, in our last session, we had talked about AI, how AI is transforming financial services. And today we hope to dive into the applications of artificial intelligence in public health. But first, Daniela, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into statistics and biostatistics? And can you talk a little bit about what your research is as a statistician?
Yeah, when I was in college, I wanted to find something that I could study that would simultaneously be impactful on science, but also would allow me to really scale my abilities across many different problem areas instead of just focusing on one area. So I realized that a really great way to do this is through statistics, and in particular, statistical machine learning, because it's a really broad tool set that can be applied to problems, as you've heard during some of your previous interviews in finance, but also in basic science and astronomy, and as we'll talk about today, in public health. And so I really became very interested in the idea of developing this tool set that I'd be able to apply to a lot of different problems over the course of my career. So in undergrad, I set myself up for graduate study in statistics, and then I did a PhD in statistics and ended up where I am now, which is at the University of Washington in Seattle, with a research focus on statistical machine learning. And so what that really means is that my research involves developing algorithms to make sense of large scale and complex and messy data sets coming out of a number of different fields.
So can you tell us a little bit about how AI has transformed public health over, say, the last 10 years? What are some of the examples of state-of-the-art AI use in public health that would have been unthinkable a few years ago? And what are some of the successes, but also failures, in terms of the efforts to use AI in public health?
That's a great question. And I think thinking about this in terms of a 10-year timeframe is really informative, because we're really in a different place from where we were 10 years ago. And so 10 years ago, a lot of the focus had to do with trying to come up with ways to use genomic data in order to guide therapy. So there was a really big hope that if we were able to sequence your DNA or profile your gene expression, then if you developed some particular type of cancer, we could use that, for example, to decide what chemotherapy to give you. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that that problem is harder than maybe people had realized. There was a big fiasco around 12 years ago involving researchers at Duke University who developed a machine learning algorithm to do exactly what I said, which is use genomic signatures to guide chemotherapy treatment, where essentially their algorithm didn't work, and yet they were using their algorithm in order to treat patients. And when the issues with their algorithm came to light, it really sort of, in my view, set that field back quite a bit. And so while that focus on using genomics in order to guide patient therapies maybe hasn't panned out as much as people might have expected 10 or 12 years ago, there have, on the other hand, been a lot of successes. And so one success that we've seen involves the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning actually in pathology and radiology. And part of the reason is because the cutting edge of AI and machine learning is very good at image recognition. So this comes up in terms of algorithms that were developed to distinguish between a coffee cup and a cat, or a cat and a dog. Well, those same types of algorithms can be used to distinguish between normal tissue versus cancer tissue, and so on. And so there's been a lot of progress in developing really assistive technologies for physicians, for radiologists and for pathologists, to improve upon their own human diagnostic capabilities with the help of machine learning or AI algorithms. But another example maybe of where we are now that I personally hadn't foreseen 10 years ago has to do with all of these wearable devices. I mean, I don't have one on today, but Often I'm walking around with an Apple Watch, and many of you, I'm sure, have similar products. And it's very cool. This is a huge amount of data, and there's a lot of potential for this to inform the way that we manage our own health, and potentially for larger scale public health benefits. And I think that's a cool and exciting possibility.
I agree. Yeah.
Great. So Daniela, one of the things that we have been talking about on these episodes in the last few weeks has been how to be able to make sure that we have a responsible use of AI in the future. And it's a complicated question because I haven't heard, and I wanted to ask you if you can maybe help us think through some of the principles, some of the principles that we should follow, or guiding principles, to make sure that what is going to be developed is responsible use of AI, particularly as it pertains to public health, what those principles might be.
Yeah, I think this is just such an important question, and we as a field need to continue grappling with this. But I always go back to the basics. Like if a doctor prescribed a medication to me and they said, take this pill twice a day, but by the way, we have no idea what the active ingredient is and nobody understands it, but some pharmaceutical company came out with this pill and we really think it's helpful, but we can't even tell you what the active ingredient is. It's like, okay, I'm not taking that pill. Like I understand I'm not a chemist, I'm not a doctor. I don't need to know all the details of the medication that I'm taking, but I need there to be some transparency. And I think that we should expect that same level of transparency when we think about AI in healthcare or in public health. So I think people just forget the expectations that we have for old-fashioned non-AI technologies, and they don't think to apply those same standards to AI. But the analogy here with the fact that I would never take a pill without knowing that at least like someone has looked into the active ingredients. Well, I don't think that we should be thinking about using algorithms for AI in healthcare when there's a total lack of transparency. There needs to be some minimum standard for transparency. We need to know like what data was used to train this algorithm. Big picture, like what is the algorithm? It can't be a complete black box that we don't understand at all. There needs to be some information shared about it. And then we also need to know that AI in healthcare is being regulated. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is an existing system of regulation for other products in healthcare that is run by the FDA. And so we just need to make sure that the way that AI in healthcare is being regulated builds upon that existing infrastructure while also adapting to the fact that AI in healthcare is a little bit different from a drug or a traditional device. So I think transparency, regulation are both important, and then also ethics. Ethics can get dicey, and we need to understand exactly what are the ethical standards that we're putting in place as we think about bringing AI into healthcare. But for example, would we be happy with a drug that, would we be happy with a use of healthcare and AI that improves people's quality of life or lifespan or whatever we're interested in for 99% of people, but then for 1% of people makes things really, really bad? Is that something that we'd be happy with? And in particular, what if the 1% of people for whom this use of AI in healthcare doesn't work well? What if that is some group that's been underserved in medicine throughout history, or a minoritized group? We just need to be careful, and we need to make sure that we have really strong foundations in place so that these ethical issues have been thought through in advance rather than on the fly.
So I think that connects really well to a question that I have for you, which is if you could talk a little bit about the importance of collaborations with public health researchers. Do you have examples of innovative collaborations or successful collaborations that actually have worked? I think some of us can point to times where there's been a failure to collaborate, where things haven't worked. But I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
So there have been a lot of really great success stories in terms of collaboration between AI researchers and public health researchers. And I think what's important for AI researchers to remember is that just because you know statistics or machine learning or AI does not mean that you have the domain expertise needed in order to actually do something useful in the setting of biomedical research or public health. So this has to be collaborative. It has to be a partnership. I've seen some really fun examples coming out of my university, which is University of Washington, where people have researchers joint between the School of Medicine and Computer Science department have for example, developed a iPhone app that makes it possible to monitor an infant's breathing or potentially to detect a drug overdose. And it's like, this is really cool. I mean, without a physician, I certainly, as an AI researcher, would have no idea about the possibility of an iPhone technology being able to monitor that type of thing. And obviously, this also requires deep technical expertise. So I think that there's a lot of really great opportunity for these collaborative partnerships. The sky is really the limit, but we're not going to get there on our own. I mean, obviously, an AI researcher who is just trying to like come up with an important idea in public health without that deep expertise and those longstanding collaborations is unlikely to do something really useful. So we do need to be able to collaborate.
So you raise a very interesting point, and actually, just going back to your previous answer on one of the guiding principles being transparency. Just earlier this week, we were talking to the FinRegLab founder, Melissa Koide, who was also doing some research in the financial world, of course, but with the idea of explainability. And she was also talking about opaqueness of algorithms that can really create all kinds of biases and unfairness, potentially leading to all kinds of problems for folks in even to the point. For one example that she gave was how home ownership might get impacted by that unfairly. I would love to be following up on that about what that unfairness and what kind of unfairness might be from the AI perspectives, the wrong use of algorithms in the public health area. And you mentioned collaboration, and I just wanted to mention that she was also talking about a very highly regulated industry in financial world, where some of the learnings or some of the things can be more easily studied and controlled. And there may be certain collaborations possible between the finance world and the public health world to transfer some of the learnings from one world to the other as well, not just within the public health arena. So I just wanted to point out to you that that research might be interesting from your perspective as well. But let me ask you again about the unfairness of AI in public health.
Yeah, well, fairness is a huge issue. So I was just reading, within the context of COVID, a lot of people went and they bought these pulse oximeters just to try to monitor their oxygen level in case they got COVID. And I was just reading that it turns out that these pulse oximeters are very accurate on people with lighter colored skin and very inaccurate on people with darker skin. And it's like, well, how did this happen? How did we get here? Well, we got here because the data used to develop these algorithms most likely was involved predominantly people with lighter skin. So that's one issue. And then another issue that can come up in terms of unfairness of these algorithms, it often has to do with sort of like, what is an algorithm actually doing? Well, an algorithm is trying to imitate the data that's seen in the real world. But if we have existing inequities in our healthcare, in people's access to care, in people's health outcomes that exist in the real world, then I can develop an awesome algorithm to imitate what I'm seeing in the real world, but that algorithm isn't going to be fair because the real world isn't fair. And so we need to think about how are we setting up our algorithms for success? And are we defining success as just imitating the status quo? Because I think most of us would agree that in a lot of ways the status quo is not fair. So that if we set up our goal to imitate the status quo, we'll end up with unfair algorithms. So I think those are two of the ways that the fairness can come in. And then finally, just a third way that fairness can come in is that often, actually almost always, these machine learning algorithms focus on some average level of performance. So for example, if you're trying to diagnose cancer, an algorithm would be viewed as successful if it correctly diagnoses cancer some very high percent of the time. So that could be really great in terms of average performance, but of course we're all individuals. And so what happens if 99% of the time this algorithm diagnoses cancer accurately, but it gets things wrong 1% of the time, where that 1% involves some underserved group? So there really are a lot of fairness issues here that have to be worked out.
No, that's great. Those are great examples, by the way, and it really helped me understand what you are saying from that perspective. A related issue, by the way, is also that we have been talking about is the privacy issues and how AI and privacy have become an increasingly important conversation to talk about. So I would love to hear some of your potential concerns that you might have on privacy and AI, particularly in the biomedical research.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? So like, whenever I think about privacy and biomedical research and an AI, I think about 23andMe, which of course putting aside the details of the company's valuation or anything like that, they've certainly been extremely successful in getting people to pay them money to take their genetic DNA, to take their to get their genetic information or to sequence their DNA. So the question is, okay, well, what are the privacy implications? So I can pay 23andMe money in order to look at my DNA and to give me the results. But what if I have an identical twin, which I don't, but I do have siblings and I do have parents and I do have kids. So it's not just my privacy that I am consenting to, it's not just my private data that I'm consenting to share with 23andMe. I'm actually essentially consenting to share my family's data with 23andMe. So it's a very weird setup. And I think that this comes up a lot in terms of healthcare. I think the DNA sequence and genetic data is maybe the most obvious example. But if I wear my Apple Watch, I'm sending Apple a lot of data about so much of the stuff that I do in terms of like how active I am and what my heart rate is and all these different things. And I think that there are really major concerns that we should be thinking about.
So I'd like to hear a little bit about the opportunities for AI to improve health going forward. How could AI contribute to healthcare? Are there examples of ways in the future that AI and public health might be working more closely together? I mean, understanding that where we're starting is that public health is not very sophisticated at this point in time in terms of technology and how it uses data. And so we're really talking about the potential for quantum leaps. And maybe, what do
Yeah,
you think? I mean,
I think that's it's interesting that you use the word quantum leaps because I would almost actually say the opposite. Like in terms of what should our goals be for AI and public health? Public health as a field, it's been around for a long time and it's not going anywhere. And similarly, like the current status quo of how medicine is practiced, I don't think we're going to see huge quantum leaps in that. So I think that if we view our task as AI researchers who are trying to impact public health as like creating a new public health system or replacing physicians or whatever it is, we're not going to get very far and we're really going to be laughed out of the room. So instead, what we need to do is try to augment or build upon the strengths of the existing systems. So what does that look like? Well, that looks like, as we already talked about, collaborating or partnering and making use of the knowledge that we already have, because we have generations of knowledge about what works in public health and what doesn't. AI is not going to be a silver bullet for us. We're not going to suddenly, eliminate heart disease as a result of AI. But the question is, how can we use AI to help mitigate some of the issues, maybe improve on a population level, even though the individual improvements might be small. And that, again, it's going to require patience, it's going to require collaboration, and it's going to require actually a little bit of humility from AI researchers. I think that AI researchers often think that, like, if I can build an algorithm that can, distinguish cats from dogs from coffee cups, then I'm good to go in public health. And it's like, yeah, but it's a little bit harder. There's people's lives at stake. And also, these are problems that smart people have been working on for generations. And so we gotta come in with some humility and try to partner and augment what is already there rather than trying to replace the system. And actually,
well,
just to clarify what I mean by replacing, oh, sorry to interrupt you. Just
no,
to
go
clarify what
ahead.
I mean by replacing the system, I really love this line of research that is like trying to use AI to, I already mentioned this one, but to like improve upon the ability of a radiologist or a pathologist to, read an X-ray or whatever it is, because there's some papers that come out where they say, like, great, we have this really good algorithm that's like more accurate than a radiologist. And it's like, gosh, like what's this paper even about? We're not going to be replacing radiologists, so that's really not helpful. But if we can find a way to assist radiologists, to allow radiologists to do their jobs better, whether more efficiently or more accurately, then that's really useful. And so I think that that's what we need to focus on, is how do we take the system that we have and find ways to improve it rather than trying to wholesale find a silver bullet or make a quantum leap.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because there are things that we already do pretty well, like reading radiographs, and other things that we don't do very well at all, like doing a reading of, say, your social and environmental determinants of health. And if I'm going to be doing prevention, how do I do that? And I think that, when we start thinking about AI in public health, we automatically also start thinking about health policy and how to
Right.
do a better job in terms of informing public health policy. And their AI and machine learning can help to support public health policy, can help to support public health decision making. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about the intersection of AI, public health, and policy. What do you see as the top priorities that should inform public health policy on AI and machine learning to support public health research and ultimately support decision making?
Right. Well, I think we got to keep ethics front and center. We have to remember that ethics still apply. We don't get to throw it out the window because we're using fancy new technologies. So if something doesn't pass the sniff test for old-fashioned medicine or public health, it's not going to pass the sniff test just because it's AI. So we got to remember that. And hand in hand with ethics is regulation. I mean, I know I'm talking to a business school audience, and I'm sure none of you love regulation, but there is a need for regulation in public health and medicine. We don't need to start from scratch. We have the FDA, we have systems in place, and we need to find a way to adapt those existing systems in order to make sure that the FDA and other relevant agencies are able to evaluate the efficacy of whatever applications for AI in public health we come up with. This is going to require well-designed and carefully run clinical trials. And this is an example of how we should be partnering with public health experts who know how to accrue that evidence efficiently. Transparency, I wouldn't take a pill if the active ingredient were a secret, and I don't think that you should use an AI algorithm that isn't clearly articulated. We need to know how it was trained. We need to know what it's doing and how. And I'm personally not interested in an AI that's a black box because I think that that's just going to cause more problems than it's going to solve. And finally, we always just have to keep coming back to equity. So how can we use AI to help underserved populations rather than just to improve the health of the most privileged people? And this is going to require careful thought because it'll be very easy to just continue the status quo unless we think about this AI as an opportunity to shift the balance here.
One thing that I would get from that point, Daniela, is that the FDA is going to need to build capability in AI in order to incorporate the evaluation of those products into their regulatory science approaches. That's going to be quite a challenge, I think, for that agency because it's a completely new area for them. And fascinating that they will have to learn how to, kind of apply. Because I agree, they can apply their statutory frameworks to that, but they don't necessarily have the science in place across that agency to do that.
Right.
It's interesting.
I mean, of course, FDA has very strong statistics and has for a long time. And I have every faith in their ability to rise to this challenge. But certainly,
So,
I mean, I agree. We don't want to just take what's there and just apply it to AI. We need to be a little more careful and refined in our treatment.
yeah, they're going to need to evolve some sophistication. I believe they can do it too. So we have researchers in public health who'd like to become more involved in AI, would like to incorporate AI into their research. And I'm wondering what kind of advice that you have for scientists, like the ones you mentioned, who already have a lot of quantitative skills. They may be statisticians already, but have not been involved with AI. How do they jump into it? What advice would you give them?
Gosh, I think that if you're a public health researcher today who wants to get involved in AI research, you should just send some cold emails because I think that you'd be surprised. There are a lot of researchers at universities in stat departments and in computer science departments who would love to get involved in like really useful and high impact applied work, but frankly don't really know where to start. And so they're sitting in their offices or I guess right now maybe in their home offices. Doing work that's less applied and maybe less useful, really for lack of those collaborations. And so I think you can be the person who reaches out, who sends that email, who I personally have no shame in sending cold emails. I don't think other people should either. And there are just so many really fun opportunities out there that would really benefit both sides. So yeah, you're not going to do it on your own, and you should be collaborating. And I think another thing to realize when we think collaboration also is like the humility that goes on both sides. So like as a public health researcher, you don't need to become a world expert on AI, but you need to find someone who is and partner with them. And similarly, if you're an AI researcher, it is not your job to identify like the world's most pressing problems in public health. And frankly, I suspect you might not be able to do so. But you should be able to find someone to work with who can help you identify those problems. So we need to come into this on both sides in good faith, and ready to work together.
Well, Daniela, this has been such a pleasure talking to you, and I know we are out of time, but I must tell you that the common thread around all of these, which you have actually very nicely, succinctly stated as top priorities going forward, the four principles or whatever you want to call them, ethics, regulation, equity, and transparency have come out in almost in one form or the other, regardless of who we were talking to and which field we were talking to. But I wanna ask one last question, and while we're in the process of getting some advice, perhaps some advice for administrators like me and for universities on how to attract more women scientists and more women into STEM areas. Would you have an opinion on that before we let you go?
Oh gosh, yeah. I think this is such an important question. How do we get more women into STEM? And to be clear, this isn't just going to benefit universities. This is going to benefit society at large, because we want to make sure that tomorrow's technologies are suitable for 100% of the population rather than just a subset of the population. And I think we need to step away from this passive language about a leaky pipeline and become more proactive and ask ourselves, what are we doing that are making these environments and these STEM fields less attractive to women? How do we remove these underlying signals that we're sending women that they don't belong in these spaces? And I think that requires a lot of introspection and really dismantling a lot of the systems that are currently in place that discourage women along the way from K-12 onwards.
Well, thank you, Daniela. That's great discussion. Really enjoyed talking to you. And Lynn, thank you very much for joining me as well in this discussion. What a pleasure. I would also like to thank all of you who joined us today and invite you to the next episode of George Talks Business. Next Wednesday, our guest will be Jenny LeFleury, Chief Accessibility Officer at Microsoft, who will be interviewed by Dr. Liesl Riddle, the Dean for Graduate Programs at the George Washington School of Business. We hope you can join us then. Thank you.